Hi, good evening. It's Wednesday evening, and tonight I'm going to talk about Chapter 8, Marketing Research, and also the Quiz 8 and how to prepare for the quiz. So before we talk about marketing research, and I think everyone agrees that marketing research is important, and if you have a business and you're going to do anything that has to do with investing money, developing a new product, or perhaps changing the packaging of the product that already exists that you have, or anything that will affect people's perception of the brand or will impact the consumer in any way. Before you take a big decision like that, you're going to want to do some research to figure out how effective that intervention might be or how successful it might be. So in terms of any business intervention or any kind of step or development, you want to use some marketing research to help you decide whether it's a sound decision or not, and whether it's the right time to take it or not. And in everyday life, I think we're doing the same thing, where we have to make decisions, we have to make sense of the world, we have to come to some conclusions, but we're doing it in a different way, where we would do marketing research in a very scientific way, in a very empirical, very structured kind of way, where we would be asking a question, we would be thinking about defining that question very, very specifically so that we're able to decide how we're going to carry out the research, and we're able to also decide if that kind of data that we collect is going to be relevant to the question that we've asked, and if it's going to answer our question ultimately. In everyday life, we really don't take things most of the time so seriously. We come to decisions that are very spontaneous. Maybe in some matters we do what could be more connected to what you would do in terms of a real research approach to coming to a conclusion. For example, let's say you're deciding on a college and you want to decide, whether you should go to a public university or a private university and which school you should choose. Maybe in that case you might do something approaching a more research-oriented program, where you would look at statistical analyses of one college versus another. You might go to one of the college guides like Peterson's that's conducted research already, or you might look at US News, where they have done rankings and they've done student surveys and they have all kinds of information on retention rates and graduation and likelihood of employment after the first month of graduation. So that you would look at all that data, and then you would come to some conclusion about which school you should go to. But most of us are not going to do, oftentimes even for a decision that important, most of us are not going to maybe do that much research. Or we do a little bit of it, but not, we spend 5 minutes, or we don't spend that much time. A lot of us, what we might do is we would ask friends, right? Or we would think about, where did our older brother go to school? He went to Brooklyn College and he became an accountant and he has a good job. So we would rely on this kind of common sense approach to understanding or to analyzing the situation. Or, for example, I go to a party late at night and I have to decide, is it safe for me to take the train home? And so I think about what other people have told me. My mom said, no, it's not safe at night. A few friends said, oh, always take a taxi after midnight. And I saw this movie where somebody was on a train and they were all alone and they got killed and something awful, and nobody was there to help them. And so therefore it's dangerous, I conclude. So this is, again, kind of common sense. It's not based on, I'm not looking at the crime statistics. I'm not analyzing to see which hour of the night or day is the most dangerous. Maybe it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the time that most crime happens, and 1 o'clock is in fact a very low crime time. So that's the reality, the scientific, established, empirical reality. But I don't really have access to that, or I don't go that deeply into it. So most of us are using common sense. Can we trust this person? Are they reliable? We're thinking about what experiences we've had in the past. We're sort of coming to a common sense understanding. Another way of answering questions and determining behavior and steps that we might take is tradition. We might rely on tradition. People have always done it that way. It's been successful, therefore I'm going to do it that way. A lot of times if you ask a person why they're choosing something, why they're doing something, they might say, well, that's the way it's always been done. My father did it that way, my grandparents did it that way, In our religion, that's how we do it. In my country, in my culture. So that's a traditional way of thinking, and it works in certain circumstances, but it's not something that can be applied to every circumstance or outside of the realm of certain kinds of moral or personal decisions. It might not be very successful to apply that kind of traditional thinking to the workplace, for example. So what we do in scientific research is we try to really look at the variables that will be important to help us understand our question, and we try to figure out a way in which we can look at how these variables are interacting with each other. So, for example, you can think about research in terms of having these two basic variables. You have an independent and you have a dependent variable. And the dependent variable is the thing that you want to study, the thing that you're hoping to analyze. So if you're interested in, looking at shopping behavior online, that's the dependent variable. And you're looking at frequency of, let's say, purchases made online, or customers' attitudes toward website versus in-store shopping, right? That's your dependent variable. Or drinking behavior, heavy drinking behavior, that's your dependent variable, what you want to study. And then the independent variables are the things that are connected to it, or that are almost, we can use the word causing it, but it's a little overstated. But it's an easy way to remember that the independent variable, or the dependent variable, depends on the independent variable, right? Or the independent variable, we could say, causes the dependent variable. So it's a way of helping us remember that, so that parents' drinking behavior or the drinking behavior of our peers causes an individual's heavy drinking behavior, right? So that would be a way of explaining it. Or men are more likely to shop online than women. So that's the independent variable. So you can almost say that being male inclines someone toward shopping online, or that being a male, we know that actually from some research, men are more likely than women to feel comfortable or do more shopping online for certain kinds of things, at least. So that maleness becomes a variable that leads to certain types of behavior, or somebody who has a certain level of education is inclined to or likely to vacation at certain places, or go to certain kinds of resorts. So that is the independent variable that leads to the behavior that you're interested in studying. So almost all research has that. Of course, in reality, we don't just have two variables that we're dealing with. We may have lots and lots of independent variables, because in human behavior, and we don't know, that's the trick, that we want to know what percentage or what proportion of somebody's likelihood to make a purchase online depends on the fact that they're male versus the level of education, or their geographic location, or their exposure to the brand, how well they know about the brand, or what their peers are doing. All kinds of different things can contribute. And so in research that deals with behavior, that deals with attitudes, it's oftentimes very complicated. And think of just this very simple example. Let's say that you have devised a very rigorous, scientific, very objective measure, a survey, let's say, to determine how people feel toward, let's say, that question we raised earlier, how men that aren't so interested in fashion, how they would feel, or how they feel when they're shopping on the Burberry website, if they find it appealing, in what ways. And we've written our questions in such a way that they're very clear, very straightforward. We're going to come up with some kind of numerical values for each of these questions, and we're going to come up with a sense of what defines the consumer and how well that consumer relates to the kind of website that we're putting forward right now. And then we can determine from those responses what kinds of things we need to do to change it to make it more appealing. So it's very scientific. But think of this, we've all heard people say this kind of thing. I haven't had my coffee yet. I'm unable to concentrate. I need to have this coffee. Before that, I'm unable, right? So let's say the same person before coffee and after coffee may have a totally different attention span, a completely different attitude, a totally different orientation to anything that's asked of them. So let's say those people that are doing that Burberry experiment. You have them come into a laboratory setting, set up with a computer. You ask them to spend a half an hour, and you're actually tracking their eye movements, and you're looking at counting the number of clicks that they're undertaking before they decide on a thing that they put in their basket. So it's all done very scientifically. Then later you're interviewing them, you're analyzing the results, but it's very scientific. But let's say the person hasn't had the cup of coffee yet. You might get a totally different response from the same person 3 hours later in the day than you would have gotten before they had the coffee. And so everything you did was scientific, but the person himself or herself was not in the kind of mood that was conducive to giving it the attention it required. So there's all kinds of pitfalls in this kind of marketing research that one can run into. And so you might want to take, you can't take everything into consideration, but maybe you wouldn't want people to come in at 7:30 in the morning, because maybe that would be not the optimal time for concentration and for analysis. So let's talk about in marketing research. There are different types of research that you should know about. We talked a little bit about pure research versus applied. Also, you have quantitative versus qualitative research. So quantitative is research that is going to result in an answer or in the generation of data that has a numerical value. So when you're doing a survey and you're asking questions like, how likely are you to return to this website, from unlikely to extremely likely, you're doing it along a scale, and you're going to pull together all those responses, and you're going to look at African American males of 23 years old who live in Brooklyn, who visited the website for the first time, and how are they very likely, and you'll look, 23% are very likely, 10% are extremely unlikely, and then you come to some conclusion, and then you have some sense of understanding this particular demographic versus another female Hispanic of 75 years old, and how she, upon visiting it 80 times, this website, how she feels about the experience. So you have this kind of numerical statistical approach where you're coming up with numbers, percentages, you're categorizing people according to various variables that you're isolating. One of the things that often is done in that kind of research is that you're saying, well, what is the contribution? You're able to control certain variables and say, what contribution does your ethnicity have to your shopping behavior versus your social class, or being male or female. You're able to kind of look at relative contributions. So that's one approach. Another more qualitative approach might be a focus group, talking to people, getting them to express their attitudes, their opinions, and you're going to analyze the data based on a different set of criteria. But it can still be done very scientifically, right? We've selected people who are in a certain kind of demographic that we want to study. We're looking at people who've had a certain exposure to the brand and comparing them to people maybe who knew nothing about the brand. But you can study it in a very in a much more in-depth way that's qualitative versus quantitative. So that's another approach. So you have the pure, the applied, the quantitative, the qualitative approach to marketing research. And we also talked about this issue of primary versus secondary. So you're always going to want to look at what other research has been done before you actually commit to doing your own research. For luxury brands, for example, and websites, you can look at, in our class, right, we can look at what students found last semester. Students did a analysis, and we have the results. The Luxury Institute analyzed those results. They're up on Blackboard. So you would want to look at that as a way of helping you understand what kind of project you should carry out if you wanted to do some marketing research, because we want to get some guidance from things that have already been done. Every year, the NYU Stern School does what they call a luxury IQ for brands, and how they're using social media and the kind of e-commerce on their website that they're providing for customers. And so that, if you search for it's called L2, the name of their program, L2, and you search for NYU and you search for luxury, you'll find this report of this luxury IQ, and you'll be able to look at what they say about Chanel versus Burberry versus other brands. So that's secondary research that already exists, makes sense to utilize it, and then you think about, okay, well, I work for Versace, and that's not included in their analysis. And I want to know how Versace is relating to women in China who are middle-aged, who are going to be buying online, who are going to be buying Versace online. I'm interested in a very, very specific question that hasn't been addressed. But we know about what Chanel's doing, we know about what Burberry's doing, so I can use that information to help me formulate a better research question when I carry out my own primary research. So something to think about now for the exam and that you need to know. Think about the different steps that are involved in marketing research. So the first step, just like in our research that we've been doing about luxury brands, about a business based in Brooklyn, if we're going to think about how well the business is presenting itself, marketing itself, the first thing we have to do is define the problem, right? Defining the problem means what is the issue, what is the question, what is the thing that we want to understand more about, that we have determined is interesting and relevant and worth further analysis. So we have to, in marketing research, define a problem. The question I gave you was about how men who don't especially like fashion, how do they relate or how do they feel about shopping on the Burberry website? And that's a particular, and what can the website do? So it's an applied kind of research to make the experience more appealing to this particular demographic. So the second thing that you have to do, you have the question, you've thought about what exactly you want to get out of it, what you want to know, why you need to know that, who you need to know it about, all of those things come into play. Then the second thing you need to do is you need to develop a research plan in all marketing research. So you have to decide on what kind of method are you going to use. Do we need to do a survey? Do we need to ask people to keep track of their shopping experiences every time they make an online purchase and to talk about what satisfied them, what made them a little bit agitated with the website experience? What is it that we're going to do? Are we going to do a focus group? Are we going to do phone interviews? We're going to call people and do interview kinds of phone surveys online. On the telephone. Maybe that's an approach to some research. Okay, so first we need to define, then we need to develop a plan. Then the next thing we have to do, once we've had the questions that we're going to ask, we know what we're searching for, we know how to get the information, we've set it up, we've decided who we need to determine what questions from. The next thing that we have to do, the third step, is that we have to collect the relevant information, right? So we have to actually carry out the research, and then we have to begin coordinating it in some way so that we can finally analyze our results. And so the fourth step is that we want to develop the results, we want to analyze them, and we want to finally provide or present our findings. So we need to analyze, and we need to develop, and we need to present the findings to have a result, to come to a result, or to come to a conclusion. So that's the last step in the research. And then it kind of, as you see, it's like a circular process. What we find relates back to what we asked. And that's why we have to be very precise and very direct, and we have to continue in a certain direction. So for the exam, just understand what marketing research is, why it's important, generally the different types of marketing research that are possible, and the steps that you have to take in order to do research. Try to understand the logic of the process, and you should be fine. So thank you very much for listening, and I will continue with another lecture soon about the Brooklyn business projects and our luxury projects and what's coming up next. Thank you.